Hi everyone, and welcome to the video presentation for Module 2. In this module we're going to talk about dominant seventh chords, leading tone seventh chords, and the voice leading that goes with those. So we're going to review the technique of creating and resolving dominant seventh chords, review the technique of creating and resolving leading tone seventh chords, and we'll end with a realization of a figured bass example which uses both of those. Okay, so let's talk about the dominant seventh chord. So in figured bass, a 7 below a bass note tells you to include the interval of a seventh above that note. So you can see here we have a B flat with a 7 under it, which means that we need to include the seventh above that B flat, which is an A flat. So in that case, we're putting the A flat in the soprano. If this 7 appears under the dominant note of the key, which is the fifth note of the scale, it creates what's called a dominant seventh chord in root position. And since the tonic key that we have here is E flat, the B flat is the dominant tone. So when we put a 7 under that B flat, it becomes a dominant seventh chord. The Roman numeral for it would be a 5-7. And because the interval of a seventh is dissonant, it must be approached and resolved with care. So that's one thing we've been learning the past couple years, or year, and including a couple weeks. And that is, whenever you have a dissonance, it must be approached a certain way and it must be resolved a certain way. In other words, this chord has a special voice leading rules that should be followed in this style of music. Okay, so let's talk about those voice leading rules. So here's kind of an incomplete example of a 2-5-1 progression in that same key of E flat, and we're going to add in the notes that belong in this example. Okay, so first, the seventh that's called for in the figured bass must be created by using a suspension, a passing tone, a neighbor tone, and then sometimes you can also use an appoggiatura. Okay, in this case, we're going to create the seventh by using a suspension. So I'm taking that A flat in the first chord, and I'm repeating it, or suspending it. Doesn't matter if you tie it or if you repeat it, it's still called a suspension. And that A flat becomes the seventh of the next chord. Okay, and in that way I'm creating the seventh by using a suspension. And the most important part of this is that the seventh must resolve down by step. So we've created a dissonance by using a suspension, and now we're going to resolve that dissonance by moving down a step into the next chord. Okay, so an A flat should move down by step to become a G, which is the third of the next chord. So you always follow this pattern of approaching, in other words, creating the dissonance, and then resolving that dissonance in a certain way. Okay. The other thing to remember is that the leading tone, like all leading tones, should resolve up by step to the tonic. And so the leading tone is found in the third of the 5-7 chord, so the third of the second chord in this example, which is the D natural in the alto voice. That, to resolve properly, needs to resolve up by step to the tonic of the key, which is E flat. Okay, and now it's kind of a rule that if it's in an inner voice, you don't have to resolve it, but I think it's always kind of best to default to resolving it, but sometimes it can't be avoided, and sometimes there are better ways to resolve, to do the voice leading and the counterpoint that would have you avoid resolving the leading tone. But it's usually the best practice to resolve that leading tone. Okay, another way to think about the voice leading is to consider the intervals that are in that 5-7 chord, in that B flat chord. And the important one is the tritone that's formed between the third and the seventh. So the D natural and the A flat in this case. So there's a tritone, which sounds like this, which is the most dissonant interval we can have in this style of music. Okay, so that dissonance resolves to a consonance in the next chord. In this case, it's a third, E flat to G. Okay, so that's one other way you can think about this. You have a dissonance tritone, and if the leading tone is on the bottom, it will resolve to a third. It can also resolve to a sixth if you flip those around. So if the D were on top in the soprano voice, the tritone would resolve to a sixth. But either way, the tritone is resolving to either a third or a sixth. Tritone dissonance is resolving to a consonance. All right. So more voice leading for the dominant seventh chord. And this part is talking about seventh chords in inversion. Okay, so what we just did was a seventh chord in root position. So a seventh chord in inversion follows the exact same rules, but this time the seventh might be in the bass, the leading tone might be in the bass. You might have them moved around in different ways, but you still follow the same rules that we just talked about. So the first one is the seventh of the chord resolves down by step, and the leading tone resolves up by step. Okay, and you can see this in the first example, that A flat is still in the soprano, so that will resolve down to the G. And then that leading tone this time is in the bass. So the D is now in the bass, so that has to resolve up by step to an E flat. Okay, and when the leading tone is in an outer voice like the bass, it does need to resolve up. There's really no way of avoiding that. Okay, and over here on the right, we have a 5 chord that is in third inversion, so the seventh is in the bass. So that seventh will resolve down by step. And now the leading tone is in the soprano, and that will resolve up by step. And that resolves to a 1 chord in first inversion. All right? Because of these rules, the leading tone having to resolve up and the seventh having to resolve down, the 6-5 chord, a 5 chord in first inversion, will always resolve to a 1 chord in root position. And same with the 4-2 chord. So that 4-2 chord, since the seventh is in the bass, it will always resolve to a 1 chord in first inversion, because that seventh has to resolve to the third of the next chord. Okay. The 4-3 chord is a little bit different. It can resolve to a 1 chord in first inversion or 1 chord in root position. Kind of has the option, because it has the fifth in the bass, which doesn't have that same requirement of resolution. Okay. The other kind of chord that we want to talk about is the fully diminished 7 chord. And the fully diminished 7 chord exists naturally on the raised 7 of a minor scale. So like in the key of C, if you built a 7th chord on the B natural, which is the raised leading tone, you would have B, D, F, and A flat, which is a fully diminished 7th chord. Okay, so the best way to look at this voice leading, I think, and this is what most music does, is it focuses on the fact that there are 2 tritones in this chord. It's a very dissonant chord. So in this voicing, you have a tritone between the bass and the tenor, so the D sharp to A, and you have another tritone between the alto and the soprano, with the C natural to the F sharp. So it's a very, very dissonant chord. So the way to resolve it is to treat each of those tritones separately and resolve them to either a third or a sixth. Okay? And so that tritone on top, where we have F sharp on top and C on the bottom, that will resolve to a sixth. And then the tritone on the bottom, where we have a D sharp to an A, that will resolve to a third. Okay, and that's the most common way you can resolve that. There's some other options too, but you always want to remember that the seventh in this chord, which in this case would be the C natural, should always be created with a suspension, a neighbor tone, or a passing tone. In this one I created it with a neighbor tone. And it should resolve down by step, so same rules. Okay, but mostly the most common way to do it is focus on the tritones, resolving to either a sixth or a third. Okay, and the leading tone, which is the root of the chord, should always resolve up by step. Okay. All right, so some things to keep in mind about voicing the 7th chord, and these are things that are only rules because they result in good voice leading. They're not rules on their own, but they're rules because of the principles of voice leading. So 7th chords can be voiced in many different ways, but the following principles should be followed. Since the root, 3rd, and 7th define the harmony, they should never be left out of the chord. Okay, so you can leave out the 5th, but you can't leave out the root, 3rd, or 7th. And that's because those tones all have a function in the chord. They define the harmony, and they also have to resolve a certain way. Okay, and without them, it doesn't sound like a seventh chord. And since they can only resolve one way, the seventh and third of the chord should never be doubled. Okay, this would create parallel unisons or octaves. So because the seventh has to resolve down by step, if you double it, you'll have two voices that need to resolve down by step, and you'll automatically get octaves, which is not good. If you double the leading tone, you'll have two voices that need to resolve up by step, and the same thing will happen. You'll have parallel octaves or unisons. And to avoid parallel fifths, this is the rule that gets a little bit confusing, but to avoid parallel fifths, root position dominant sevenths that are complete, in other words, they have the root, third, fifth, and seventh, they have all four of their notes. Dominants that are complete must be followed by incomplete tonic triads, right? So if you're going to have a complete seventh chord, the chord that follows it, the tonic triad, cannot have all of its notes. It will have to leave out the fifth, okay? But it's also true in reverse. So if you want to resolve to a tonic triad that has all of its parts, that has a root, a third, a fifth, then your dominant seventh chord will have to be incomplete. It will have to be missing the fifth, okay? All right, so let's look at an example. And this is the key of D minor. We will have a fully diminished seventh chord and a 5/7 at the end in inversion. Okay, we're going to, as we do this, we're going to keep the voice leading principles in mind. Okay, and so let me get to the marking tool up here. I can experience my awesome handwriting. Okay, so let's start at the end, and let's, starting at the cadence is good. Let's go ahead and create some contrary motion with our bass. So we probably want the soprano to have our C sharp. We know that we need a C sharp because here it says sharp 4 in the figured bass. And a fourth above G is C, and we sharp it to become a C sharp. That's also the leading tone of this key, so it needs to be included. Okay. Now, right off the bat, we already have the parts of the chord that need to resolve a certain way. So this G is actually the seventh of our chord because the root of this chord is A. So if I wrote this chord in root position, I'd have A, C sharp, E, and then our G here. So we know that the seventh, this G, has to resolve down by step, and the C sharp here has to resolve up by step because that's the leading tone of the key. All right, so with that information in mind, we lucked out because that already resolves down by step in the bass, which is good. So all we need to do is resolve our soprano, which is on the leading tone, and that will be the note D. Okay? And you can tell right off the bat that this is not a perfect authentic cadence because we have two chords in inversion. So even though this does end on the 1, right? Because this last chord is a 1/6, because the root of that chord is D. We know that this is a authentic cadence of some kind, but it is an imperfect authentic cadence because both the 5 chord and the 1 chord are in inversion. So we have a 5/4/2 resolving to a 1/6, which is an imperfect authentic cadence. Okay, let's go back to the beginning and try to write sort of a good melody to go with this. So let's start again on the tonic. So give the soprano a D there. Now let's create some contrary motion with the bass. So let's go up to this note E, which we can use because that's a third above C sharp, which is fine. And then let's do some variety. Instead of going down to the D, let's go up to the F. All right. Now, after that, we have a leap of a third in the bass. So to counter that, maybe we'll want to have a leap of a third in the opposite direction in our soprano. And we can do that because this chord requires a 6th above it. And then this one is a root position G chord. So we can repeat our note D for some oblique motion. And there we go, a pretty decent soprano line. So let me play that for you. very dark. Very good. Okay. Now let's voice this first chord, and there's probably a lot of different ways you can do this, but since it's a pretty big range between the bass and the soprano, we should probably try to spread it out as much as we can. So we'll give our third, which will be F, to our alto, and we'll give our A to our tenor there. Okay. Now let's go on. So we need to have a third above this chord, which we already have with our soprano. We need to have a fifth above this chord, which we could give, that's going to be a G, and the closest note to G, well, they're actually both close, aren't they? So why don't we give that, let's give that to the alto. Okay. And then let's give the B flat to our tenor. Okay. So now remember that there are some tritones in this chord here. And the first tritone is between actually our C sharp and our G. Okay. So our C sharp moves up, which means we want to resolve our other voice down in the opposite direction. So we'll give that to the alto, the F. Now this B flat here is a seventh, and so that needs to resolve down by step 2, and it also creates a tritone with our E natural in the soprano, so we want to resolve that in the opposite direction too, so we'll give that, we'll move that to A. Okay, and that's probably the best resolution of that chord we can come up with that melody there. Okay. Doubling the third is not always the best choice, but I think in this case we don't really have a choice. And so let's look at our next chord. So we already have our root, or sorry, our bass note F and our root in the soprano. Okay, so we need to have a fifth. So the closest note to the fifth is the tenor there, so we can repeat that. Alto might be a problem. We could, well, yeah, actually we can repeat that F. It's always a good idea to double the bass. Okay, so let's do that. So that looks fine, I think. Yeah, great. All right, on our next chord, we need a third above our G, so we can give that to our tenor, which is the B flat. And then we need a, we preferably want to double our octave, or sorry, our root, which would be G, but we can't give that to the alto because that would create parallel octaves with our bass. We don't want to do that. So we need to find a different note to give it, and we could, let's see, we could give it, we could have it jump down to the D, double the fifth. I think another option, that's probably the only option actually, let's leave that. Okay, now in the next chord, we have our sharp 4 already. We need to have a second above that G, which we could give to our tenor. Okay, so the tenor will go down to A to form a second. Now the thing that's missing from this is 6, right? Because 6 is always part of these seventh chords. And a sixth above the G is going to be an E, so we can give that to our alto, like so. Now, I know that I just said that complete seventh chords have to be followed by incomplete triads, but that's not true if you have two chords that are in inversion. Okay, and so since both of these chords are in inversion, we can actually have both of them be complete. So we could have our alto go up to the F, and our tenor could stay on the A, and then we have all the notes that we need to have that chord be complete. Okay, so that's another rule, is when you have a 5/7 chord that's an inversion, you don't have to follow the complete incomplete rule. Okay, let me play this. Here we go. Very nice. I like it. Okay. Now let's do some analysis. We already did the last two chords. So our first chord here, with that root of bass note D and no figured bass, that's going to be a 1 chord in root position. Here we have another root position 7th chord, so it's a C sharp with a 7 under it. That means root position. So this is going to be a 7. You know, one day I'm going to be able to write Roman numerals nicely on this. That is not this day. And then this will be fully diminished, 7. Then we have another root position chord with the D in the bass, so that is 1. Over here we have a first inversion chord with F in the bass, so we know that the root is a 3rd below that. So this is a 1, 6. And then finally, our last chord is also root position with G in the bass, so that's going to be a 4 chord, which leads to our 5, 4, 2, which resolves to 1, 6. Okay, great. So keep any questions you have about this in mind, and we can go over it in our Zoom sessions. And I hope this helped. Great. Thanks for watching, and have a great day.